He hadn't noticed her at first. That morning had started like any other. Early coffee, the soft hum of printers firing up across the open plan office, and the dull overhead lights that seemed to wash the color from everything. It was a Thursday, and the weight of deadlines had already settled on Ethan's shoulders like a familiar, unwelcome coat. His fingers had been flying across his keyboard, distracted by the usual grind, when Davis, the boss, made a rare appearance outside his glass office, clapping a hand on Ethan's shoulder and mumbling something about his sister popping in. He hadn't given it much thought. Davis was an odd mix of fastidious and aloof, the kind of man who could give you a promotion and forget your name in the same breath. His sister. Ethan barely remembered she existed, but she was here, somewhere, and when he found her, it wasn't how he expected. It was nearly 11 when he ducked into the break room, drawn more by muscle memory than need. The hum of the vending machine was the only sound, until he realized he wasn't alone. She stood near the window, backlit by the faint light, pouring coffee into one of the cheap ceramic mugs no one ever used. She didn't turn around immediately, but something about the tilt of her head, the casual curve of her stance, made him pause in the doorway. He almost said something, a polite hello or a quip about weak office coffee. But then she turned. Her eyes met his. It wasn't the eyes that caught him first, though they were striking. A deep, smoldering hazel, framed by thick lashes that looked almost too deliberate for someone casually visiting an office. No, what struck Ethan was the stillness that followed, a silence that hung in the air not awkwardly, but expectantly, like something had just shifted, and both of them felt it at once. "You must be Ethan," she said, her voice low and even, with a warmth that felt practiced, or maybe just naturally magnetic. She offered a faint smile, tilting the mug slightly in his direction. "Coffee?" He blinked. Yeah, sure. Thanks." He stepped in slowly, shutting the door behind him like he'd been invited to something private, though no invitation had been spoken. "I'm Natalie," she said, handing him the mug with a brush of her fingers against his. Not a graze, not quite a touch. Just enough to be noticed. "Davis's little sister. I remember him mentioning you were visiting." He took the mug and sipped, though the coffee was scalding. "Didn't expect you to be here, in the break room." She laughed softly, and it was the kind of laugh that didn't belong in a place like this. Too sultry, too slow, like she was enjoying the irony of it. "I was looking for a quiet spot. Places like this don't leave much room to breathe." He nodded, unable to stop himself from watching her. She wasn't dressed to blend in. A deep green blouse, tucked just enough to hint at the curve of her waist. Dark jeans, slim but not tight, the fabric shifting subtly with each motion. Her hair was loose, a little messy, not unkempt, but effortless. It was clear she hadn't come just to see the office. And now, standing here, the space felt suddenly too small. "So, what do you do here?" she asked, leaning against the counter, her gaze never quite leaving his. "Digital strategy," he replied, trying not to fidget. "I help companies not embarrass themselves online." She smirked. A noble cause. Their eyes locked again. Longer this time. There was a challenge there, unspoken, a subtle edge in the way she looked at him like she already knew what he was thinking. He wasn't sure what unnerved him more, the fact that she was his boss's sister, or the way her presence made his skin feel electric, his pulse quickening in places he didn't want to acknowledge. "Is it always this quiet in here?" she asked, stepping closer. Just half a step, but enough that the space between them became perceptible, intimate. "Not usually," he said, voice a little rougher now. "But I guess people are still avoiding each other after the all-hands meeting." "Good," she murmured. "I like it quiet." There was something about her tone, the deliberate way she let that silence stretch between them. She set her mug down, slowly, her eyes flicking to his mouth before returning to his eyes. A quick, subtle flicker, but he caught it, and it sent something sharp and warm through his chest. He tried to clear his throat, shake it off. "You're not what I pictured when I thought of Davis's sister." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that a compliment?" He hesitated. "I'm not sure I should answer that." "Smart man." She stepped even closer now, and this time there was no mistaking it. She was within his reach, so close he could smell the faint scent of jasmine on her skin, so close he could feel the heat radiating off her. Her voice dropped just a bit lower, just a touch more dangerous. "You've got good instincts, Ethan." Her gaze dropped again, to his hands, to the way he gripped the mug a little too tightly, then back up to his eyes. "But I wonder how long you can keep them." It was then that the break room door rattled, just once, and a burst of laughter filtered in from the hallway. Natalie didn't flinch, didn't step back. She simply tilted her head and smiled at him, like she'd just delivered a dare. "Guess we're not alone after all," she whispered. And just like that, she stepped back, picked up her coffee, and walked out without another word. Her fingers brushed the door as she left, trailing along the frame as if to leave a mark. Ethan stood frozen, the mug still in his hand, heart pounding hard enough to echo in his chest. He already knew it. This was not the last time he would see her, not even close. The rest of the day passed like a strange, slow fever, one Ethan couldn't shake even as emails piled up and phone calls blurred into one another, every corner of his mind still echoing with the memory of Natalie's voice, the scent of her perfume, and that hypnotic gaze that seemed to pin him in place without effort, like she had stepped into his day not by accident, but with deliberate, quiet purpose. He had tried to convince himself that it was nothing, that she was simply charismatic, maybe a little too confident, and used to getting attention. But that lie fell apart every time he closed his eyes and saw the way her lips curved when she said his name, or the precise way her fingers had brushed his when she handed him the coffee, like she knew exactly what kind of ripple it would send through him, and did it anyway. Natalie hadn't returned to the break room after that, nor had she made any other appearance near his department. And yet Ethan couldn't help but feel her presence everywhere, like the air had changed since she arrived, like the shadows had grown longer, softer, and filled with something wordless and waiting. When 5 o'clock rolled around, most of the office emptied in a slow exodus, people disappearing in 2s and 3s, murmuring about drinks or dinner or just needing to breathe. But Ethan stayed frozen in his chair, pretending to finish a spreadsheet he'd already completed, telling himself he wasn't waiting for anything. Least of all her, even as the building quieted and the lights dimmed overhead. Eventually he stood, stretching with a sigh that was far more about frustration than fatigue, and walked slowly toward the break room again, unsure of what he expected. Maybe just silence, or maybe the phantom of a moment replaying itself in his mind, the air thick with memory and regret and a hunger he hadn't dared to name. But when he pushed the door open, it wasn't empty. She was there again. Natalie stood by the same window, holding a half-full bottle of water, her other hand tucked into the back pocket of her jeans. And she didn't look surprised to see him. In fact, she didn't look startled at all, as though she had been expecting him to show up, as though this room had become something more than just a place for coffee and idle talk. "You're still here," she said, her voice like velvet laced with something heavier, something that tugged at the chest like gravity, in reverse. Ethan swallowed, closing the door behind him, his hand lingering on the knob a second too long, before he let it go. "Could say the same about you." She tilted her head, that same sly smile curling the corner of her mouth, not smug, not cruel, just intimate, as if they were already past the point of small talk and into the space where words were less important than silences. "I wasn't ready to leave yet," she said, her voice softer now, each word drawn out with careful precision, like she was tasting them before letting them go. He didn't move closer, not yet, but his body leaned slightly forward, his eyes caught by the way the light grazed the curve of her jaw, the way her blouse clung delicately to her figure, hinting but never giving everything away, and it struck him again how completely she didn't belong here. Not in this room, not in this mundane building, not in this hour, unless she had chosen to be. "You like watching me," she said suddenly, not accusing but observational, as though she'd plucked the truth from the air like a thread unraveling from a sleeve. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. "I noticed," she added, her voice dropping just enough to send a shiver down his spine. "From the moment you stepped in this morning." There was a beat of silence, filled only by the hum of the fridge and the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. And then she stepped closer. Not fast, not dramatically, but with the kind of steady grace that made every inch between them feel electric, charged with something old and dangerous and entirely new. "Your boss," Ethan said quietly, as if that word still had the power to mean anything in the space between them. "My brother," she corrected, brushing past him to set the water bottle down on the counter, her arm grazing his lightly, deliberately, the contact feather light, but full of suggestion. "But I'm not here for him." That sentence hung in the air like smoke, lingering, curling, refusing to dissipate, and when he turned toward her, she was already facing him, her eyes scanning his face with a slowness that made his skin prickle and his breath catch. "Why are you here?" he asked, knowing it wasn't about a tour of the office or some nostalgic sibling visit. Not anymore. Maybe never was. "I wanted to see what he was so proud of," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "And now I know." His heart thudded once, hard, and he could feel the heat rising in his chest, in his throat, in the space between them that seemed to shrink with every breath they took. "You're not supposed to say things like that," he murmured, though his voice lacked conviction, and she smiled again, slow and wickedly calm. "No," she said, "but I like doing what I'm not supposed to." Her hand lifted then, barely, fingertips brushing against the fabric of his sleeve, tracing the line of his arm as though curious what he would do. Would he step away? Flinch? Break the spell? But he didn't. He stayed still, letting the moment stretch, letting her hand continue its quiet path until her fingers came to rest just above his wrist, warm and confident, and absolutely unhurried. "I'm not used to being caught off guard," Ethan said, his voice a low confession that surprised even him. "And I'm not used to being resisted," Natalie replied, her thumb now brushing softly across his wrist, her eyes holding his with an intensity that was nearly unbearable in its directness. They were so close now that he could see the faint line of freckles across the bridge of her nose, the way her lips parted just slightly when she inhaled, like she was breathing him in, and every part of him screamed for caution, but none of him moved. I shouldn't be here, he whispered. Maybe, she said, her fingers moving to the inside of his wrist now, a pulse point, her touch impossibly gentle. But you are. His breath came shallower now, the air between them hot and heavy and full of questions. Neither of them had the courage to answer. Not yet. But she stepped forward, closing the final inch between them so that their bodies were nearly touching, her voice a breath against his cheek as she added, "And I think we both know this isn't over." She pulled away then, not abruptly, not cruelly, just enough to make the absence of her presence feel like a vacuum, a cold spot where warmth had just been. "I'll see you tomorrow, Ethan," she said softly, like a promise or a warning, he couldn't tell which. And then she was gone, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of jasmine and a heart that no longer remembered how to beat normally. He didn't move for a long time, didn't speak, didn't even finish his coffee. Because something had started between them, something quiet and slow and hungry, and whether he liked it or not, it had already pulled him into its orbit. And Natalie. She was gravity itself. The following morning arrived with a strange and almost mocking clarity. Sunlight pouring through Ethan's apartment windows in bright, unwavering sheets, as if the sky itself was unconcerned with how disoriented he felt, how deeply unsettled he had become in the span of a single day, haunted not by guilt or regret, but by the memory of a gaze that had seen too much and touched nothing. Not yet. He went through the motions of getting ready, showering with the water turned up too hot, dressing slower than usual, lingering with indecisive hands on shirt collars and belts, his reflection in the mirror offering no comfort, only the vague expression of someone who had been turned inside out by something they couldn't quite name, let alone admit to desiring. By the time he stepped into the office, coffee in hand and heart pounding, the air already felt different. Not chaotic or tense, but charged, humming with an invisible frequency he was now attuned to, one that didn't come from emails or co-workers or looming deadlines, but from the knowledge that somewhere in this building, Natalie was walking the same hallways, breathing the same recycled air, perhaps already watching him from across a crowded room, with that same unflinching stillness that had undone him the day before. He tried to focus on his work, bury himself in the screen, but every keystroke felt hollow, every meeting a half-heard blur, every polite conversation just a thin layer of social camouflage for the storm building steadily beneath his skin. A storm shaped like her voice, her scent, her deliberate silences, all of it weaving into him like a second heartbeat. It wasn't until close to noon, when the office buzz dulled and co-workers trickled out for lunch, that he saw her again, this time in motion, walking down the main hallway with a pace that was unhurried yet purposeful, her blouse a deep burgundy that clung to her like it had been tailored to read minds, her dark hair falling in soft, deliberate waves over her shoulders, and her expression unreadable, until she passed him and let her gaze catch his for exactly 3 seconds too long. It was not an accident. She didn't smile, didn't break stride, didn't say a word. Just a look, smooth and clean and devastating, as if she had reached out and touched the center of his chest without lifting a finger. By the time she disappeared down the hall and into a conference room, he was already standing, already moving, not chasing exactly, but following the pull of something inevitable, like the tide responding to the moon, slow, sure and helpless to resist. But she wasn't in the break room this time, nor the lobby, nor anywhere else he searched for the next 10 minutes, while pretending he wasn't searching at all, until he rounded the corner by the storage alcove, a narrow, dim hallway near the copy room, rarely used and poorly lit, and found her leaning against the door frame, arms crossed, watching him with a patience that was almost predatory in its stillness. "You look like you've been looking for me," she said, her voice low, her tone more amused than surprised, as though she had simply walked into a place where she knew he would eventually arrive. Like all roads in his world had begun to lead to her. Ethan stopped mid-step, 1,000 reflexes telling him to turn back, to say something innocuous, to laugh it off or pretend he was just heading toward the copier. But none of those excuses made it to his lips, because in that moment the air between them was not a place for lies, only confessions unspoken and breaths held too long. "Maybe I have," he said finally, his voice hushed and raw, the hallway's quiet swallowing his words and making them feel more intimate than he'd intended. She pushed off the door frame with a slow grace, taking 2 small steps toward him, and suddenly they were in each other's space again, the distance between them shrinking until it barely existed, until he could feel her breath and see the pulse in her neck, and smell the same soft, floral perfume that had clung to him all night in memory. "Do you like this?" she asked, not teasing but curious, genuine in a way that caught him off guard. Her hand lifting slowly, fingertips hovering near his chest, not touching, just feeling the heat of him. "This?" he echoed, barely able to speak, his throat dry and his heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack his ribs from the inside out. "This tension," she clarified, her voice dropping to a whisper, her eyes now locked on his with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "This pull between us. I don't know what it is," he admitted, his voice quieter still, "but I can't stop thinking about it." Her fingers brushed his shirt then, just once, just barely, and the sensation was like a spark, sharp and aching, and impossible to ignore. And for a moment, neither of them moved, caught in a moment suspended outside of time, outside of consequences, where the only thing that mattered was this, her touch, his breath, and the echo of everything they hadn't said yet. "You could walk away," she murmured, stepping close enough that their bodies brushed, the contact light but undeniable. "Say this is a bad idea, that I'm your boss's sister, that it's nothing." "But it's not nothing," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them, and the truth of it settled over them like heat, thick and undeniable. "No," she agreed, her hands now sliding gently to rest on the fabric of his sleeves, her touch light but steady. "It's not." He didn't kiss her. Not yet. But the moment pressed forward like a tide swelling at the edges, pushing them toward the brink, and he could feel it in the way she leaned in slightly, her head tilted, her eyes half-lidded, her lips parted like she was waiting for permission. Not from him, but from the world itself. He exhaled, and that breath brushed against her cheek like a secret. And still, he didn't move. And then, she did. Her fingers slid slowly down his arms, wrapping around his wrists with a softness that felt almost reverent. And she leaned up just slightly, her voice so low, he felt it more than heard it when she said, "Tell me to stop." He couldn't. He didn't. Instead, his hands found her waist, tentative at first, then firmer, like he was anchoring himself to her, or maybe letting go of everything else. And her body responded by pressing lightly into his, the shape of her fitting against him in a way that was maddeningly perfect. She tilted her face toward his, their noses nearly brushing, the air between their lips growing warmer by the second. And when she finally kissed him, it wasn't hesitant or cautious or timid. It was slow and devastating. A kiss that asked no questions but answered them all. And the moment their mouths met, the tension between them shattered like glass beneath a hammer. His arms tightened around her, pulling her close, and her hands slid up to cradle the back of his neck, her fingertips threading through his hair with a hunger that belied her otherwise calm exterior. And he kissed her like he had wanted to since the second he saw her. Deeply, fully, like he needed her to know that whatever this was, it was already beyond control. When they broke apart, their breaths ragged and mouths close, she rested her forehead against his and closed her eyes, her voice a whisper against his skin. "This was inevitable," she said. And for the first time, he didn't disagree. The afternoon light had dimmed into that soft, golden hush that made the office feel less like a place of business and more like the aftermath of something personal, something secret. The walls still humming faintly with everything they had done and not done. The silence thick with the echoes of their mouths pressed together, of breath shared and restraint unraveling, thread by delicate, deliberate thread. Ethan hadn't returned to his desk. Neither had she. The air between them had shifted entirely since that kiss. Not just a moment of contact, but an unspoken vow wrapped in warmth and tension. A confirmation of everything they had been tiptoeing around since the break room, since the first glance, since that flicker of something dangerous and tender settled beneath their skin and refused to leave. Now they stood in a stairwell on the west side of the building, one that nobody used after hours, tucked away behind a rarely locked security door and coated in the soft gray of institutional paint and forgotten cleaning schedules. And it should have felt cold, sterile, functional. But in the amber light cutting through the narrow window slats, it felt sacred. Natalie was leaning against the wall, one foot pressed flat behind her, arms folded loosely, but eyes locked onto his with that same unwavering steadiness that had undone him from the beginning. And Ethan stood across from her like he was afraid to get too close, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew what would happen if he did. They had already kissed. They had already crossed something, but it hadn't gone further. Not yet. And now they stood on the edge of it, their bodies motionless but their hearts sprinting, everything inside them stretching thin and trembling between desire and hesitation, between what they were and what they were about to become. "I should go," he said softly, though he didn't move. She tilted her head, her gaze never leaving his. "You won't." He exhaled slowly, the sound catching in his chest like something breaking. "You're right." Natalie stepped forward then, just one step, but it shortened the space between them enough that he could feel the heat of her body, enough that he saw her lashes tremble with the force of the restraint she still somehow carried in her small, careful frame. "You've been fighting this," she said, her voice so gentle it felt like a fingertip against the inside of his wrist. "Even now." "I don't want to," he admitted. And there was a quiet shame in the way he said it, as if wanting her, needing this, had become a kind of surrender he hadn't been prepared to make. She reached up then, not to touch his face or pull him into her, but to unfasten the delicate chain around her neck, a thin gold strand with a small charm, and when it slipped through her fingers and into her palm, she closed her fist around it and looked at him in a way that sent a chill down his spine. "You keep waiting for a reason to walk away," she whispered, stepping closer, her body now barely an inch from his. "And I keep hoping you won't." Ethan stared at her, his breath shallow, his eyes scanning her face for something. Maybe weakness, maybe doubt, but finding only patience and a quiet intensity that was almost unbearable in its stillness. "I'm scared of what happens if we do this," he said, his hands tightening at his sides like he didn't trust them. What it'll mean. She leaned in, so close now that her lips brushed the corner of his jaw when she spoke. It'll mean we stop pretending. And then she kissed him again. Slower this time, deeper. The kind of kiss that wasn't about hunger or impulse, but about certainty. About closing the distance in a way that couldn't be undone. Her mouth moved over his with the warmth of someone who had already made the decision and was simply waiting for him to join her in it. And he did. He responded with a sound that was half sigh, half groan, pulling her into him with arms that no longer hesitated, his fingers pressing into her back like he needed to hold her in place or lose her forever. Their bodies aligned in that stairwell like puzzle pieces, long separated, every inch of them answering some unspoken question, with movement, with contact, with the quiet, steady rhythm of two people giving in. She pressed into him, her hand sliding up under his collar, her fingers brushing the edge of his neck, and he gasped softly into her mouth, the sensation enough to set something off inside him. A need that had been building in slow pulsing waves, now crashing through him with dizzying force. When she broke the kiss, she didn't step back. She stayed close, her forehead resting lightly against his, their breath mingling in the narrow space between them, their bodies flush and warm and trembling slightly. "We crossed it," she murmured. He nodded, his voice low and wrecked. "There's no going back now." "Good," she whispered, kissing him again, this time shorter, fiercer, her hands gripping his shirt like she wanted to hold on to the moment and never let it go. They stayed there for what felt like hours. Or maybe just seconds that stretched and folded into each other, timeless and urgent, before Ethan finally pulled her fully into his arms, holding her like he was afraid to wake up from whatever spell they had just cast together. And in the silence that followed, there was no guilt, no apology, only the undeniable truth that they had passed through something irreversible, something intimate and consuming, and that neither of them would ever be the same again. When they finally pulled apart, the hallway was dark, but they didn't feel lost. They had found something, each other, and whatever came next, it would not be ordinary. Not after this, not after her, not after them.